Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video. And today I'm going to be doing my July wrap up and telling you everything that I read in July. So July for me is Jane Austen July, which is a month-long readathon I host with Marissa from Blakely Bookish and Claudia from the Spencer's Library. I'll link our announcement videos down below if you want to learn more about it for next year if you didn't manage to take part this year. But Jane Austen July basically means a month filled with Jane Austen related books, and I had a lovely Jane Austen July this year. I read 12 things and I watched 2 things, all of which I really enjoyed. It was a pretty successful Jane Austen July. So I will start off with the classics, as I always do in my wrap-ups, and I'll start off with the books I read that were actually by Jane Austen, and I read 3 things by Jane Austen this month. So the first challenge for Jane Austen July every year is to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels, and I reread 2. So I listened to both of these on audiobook, and the first one was Northanger Abbey, which was published in 1817, posthumously, just after Jane Austen's death, though we think actually it's probably one of the first books she wrote back in the 1790s or early 1800s. Northanger Abbey was one of our group reads for the year, and I really enjoyed my rereading of it. I listened to it on audiobook, which was really fun. It is, if you don't know, the story of a young woman called Catherine Morland, who's 17 years old. She's taken by some family friends to Bath, where she meets new friends, including a pair of siblings, Henry and Eleanor Tilney, who ends up inviting her to stay with them at their mysterious mansion, Northanger Abbey. The book is in many ways a coming of age story, but it's also very much a sort of parody and critique of Gothic novels. Catherine Morland has a vivid imagination, and Jane Austen has a lot of like meta references to fiction and novels, and kind of like what you would or wouldn't expect a heroine to do in a certain situation, stuff like that, which is really, really fun. I really, really love the meta stuff in Northanger Abbey and the way Jane Austen kind of like picks apart novel structure. That is something I really, really enjoy in it. But overall, it is not my favourite Jane Austen. It is probably my least favourite Jane Austen. In fact, it is my least favourite Jane Austen. I just like her other books more. I feel like Northanger Abbey is quite short, and it feels like a little bit less developed, I suppose, than her other books. I feel like the minor characters, there's less of them, they're less interesting. Like, I still love Northanger Abbey. I still think it's a great book, but it's just not my favourite Jane Austen. There are other ones I like a lot more, such as the other Jane Austen book I reread this Jane Austen July, which was Sense and Sensibility, which is Jane Austen's novel from 1811, her first published novel. And this was another book that I read for the Jane Austen July challenge to read one of Jane Austen's main 6 novels. Sense and Sensibility is the story of 2 sisters, Eleanor and Marianne, and after the death of their father, their mother and their younger sister Margaret and them are not allowed to stay in their family home, which their elder half-brother has inherited. They end up moving across the country to live in a small cottage in a new area, and we basically follow Eleanor and Marianne, their romantic relationships, their sibling relationships, their relationships with their friends. Eleanor has a lot of sense, she's very rational, and Marianne has a lot of sensibility, she's very emotional. And the book is kind of set up as a sort of dichotomy, I suppose, and a sort of battle between sense and sensibility, between Eleanor and Marianne's kind of different worldviews, I suppose. I love Sense and Sensibility a lot. I've been on like a long journey with Sense and Sensibility, where this used to be my least favourite Jane Austen novel, and now I love it and it's one of my favourites. I think I have reread Sense and Sensibility every year for the past 3 years, with sort of increasing love for it each time. And each time I have listened to the audiobook narrated by Rosamund Pike, which I would really, really recommend. Rosamund Pike is such a fantastic audiobook narrator. And yeah, there's so much I love about Sense and Sensibility. I don't even know where to start. I love the sibling relationships, I love the minor characters. I think it is so deep and rich, and there's so much to think about. I'll link down below a video I made last Jane Austen July called Falling in Love with Sense and Sensibility. I think I'll probably read it next year too, and maybe that'll be like fine for a while. But I'm just like really enjoying the novelty of loving Sense and Sensibility and adoring it when it used to be my least favourite. And now I'm like, how did I ever think Northanger Abbey was better than Sense and Sensibility? Sense and Sensibility is the best. Anyway, the other thing I read by Jane Austen in Jane Austen July was some of her juvenilia, which was part of our other group read for the month. So we were reading a lot of Jane Austen's juvenilia, which ticked off the second challenge for Jane Austen July, to read something by Jane Austen that is not one of her main 6 novels. So I read quite a lot of juvenilia from this collection here, but also some online. I'll leave the list of the Jane Austen juvenilia that I read down below. I read all the juvenilia that was on our group read, which is the majority of the juvenilia by Jane Austen that it is easy to find online. I just really enjoyed reading Jane Austen's juvenilia, as I always do. It is very silly and fun and scandalous and a bit kind of dramatic, a bit sort of like over the top, and it's really fun to see how Jane Austen was like unpicking the ways novels worked from a really young age. Like if you read something like Jack and Alice or Love and Friendship, like she is really engaging with like fictional tropes and kind of turning them on their heads and critiquing them in a really, really fun way. Like she obviously just had a lot of fun parodying things, and like working her siblings' names into stories and then like killing them off or like making them do really bad things, which is just very entertaining. A lot of Jane Austen's juvenilia is like dedicated to her siblings, and you can just imagine her like reading them aloud in like a family party and them all having a good giggle about it. So yeah, I really, really enjoyed Jane Austen's juvenilia. Then I also read 4 other things this month that were from Jane Austen's time but not by Jane Austen, all of which ticked off challenge 5 of Jane Austen July, which is to read something by a contemporary of Jane Austen. So I read 2 plays. We'll start off with them. One play that I read was The Rivals by Richard Brinsley Sheridan, which is from 1775, the year of Jane Austen's birth. This is a play that we know Jane Austen was familiar with, and in The Genius of Jane Austen by Paula Byrne, a really interesting non-fiction book I read last year, she talks about how Jane Austen is kind of like in conversation with the rivals in Sense and Sensibility, which is really, really interesting. And actually the rivals, like Sense and Sensibility, critiques a sort of like sentimental novel as a form and kind of critiques like over sentimentality. The Rivals is set in Bath, and it's basically about various characters and various sort of like romantic misunderstandings. So the heroine is very, very emotional and sentimental and has like very strong ideas about what is and isn't romantic. And so she's decided that she, being a wealthy upper class young woman, couldn't possibly fall in love with a wealthy upper class young man. A young man who is in love with her, who is of a high class, has pretended to be a much lower rank in the army so that she'll like him, and she does really like him when he's pretending to be a lower rank. They're in love, but then his father comes to town and decides to arrange a match between him and her. But the young heroine says of course she's not going to marry this titled man she's only just heard of, because she's actually in love with this junior person in the army. They are one and the same, she doesn't know. Lots of silly misunderstandings follow, but it's very sort of like meta and sort of criticising the sentimental novel and sort of like romance plot lines, I suppose. There's various other like rival stories going on as well. In general, I really liked The Rivals. I thought it was a good fun play, and I really enjoyed the way it like, yeah, looked at sentiment and emotion, I suppose. And I thought it was quite funny. So I would recommend The Rivals, a good play from the time of Jane Austen. And then I also read The Bell's Stratagem by Hannah Cowley, which is from 1780. This play I didn't like quite as much as The Rivals. Again, it kind of is a sort of romantic comedy, I suppose. They're both romantic comedies, really. There is a young woman and a young man whose guardians have kind of like arranged a match between them. And when they meet for the first time, she falls desperately in love with him, but he's sort of indifferent to her. So she comes up with like a plan to trick him into falling in love with her. I think I said this in one of my vlogs, but The Bell's Stratagem felt like a very Shakespearean comedy, but really much less good for having not been written by Shakespeare. Like, it was fun, and the misunderstandings are kind of comical, and there were some kind of good moments, but in general it felt like a bit lackluster for me, I suppose. I think it would probably be quite decent staged, but it wasn't a massively fun one to read. So if you were going to read one of those plays, I would recommend The Rivals over The Bell's Stratagem, because I feel like the way The Rivals plays with kind of conventions of literature and sort of like mocks love stories was quite fun, whereas The Bell's Stratagem kind of felt like a more flat play, I suppose, for me. Then another thing I read this month was Belinda by Maria Edgeworth, which is a novel from 1801. I would really recommend the audiobook, actually. The audiobook I listened to was narrated by Lucy Scott, who plays Charlotte Lucas in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice adaptation. I feel like that should be like double Jane Austen July points or something like that. Anyway, I really enjoyed listening to the audiobook of Belinda. So Belinda by Maria Edgeworth is a really interesting novel that I have like complicated feelings about, but it was exciting to read because I definitely would like to read more by Maria Edgeworth in the future. I really like the way she writes, and especially the way that she writes in a very meta style, like The Rivals, like Northanger Abbey or Sense and Sensibility, where she's sort of like critiquing novels of the time time. Belinda as a book is hugely self-aware of its own nature as a novel, which I think is really fun. So Belinda is the story of a young woman called Belinda. Belinda is a well-meaning, good-hearted young woman who is sent for the season to stay with a wealthy couple, Lord and Lady Delacour. Lady Delacour is a sort of socialite who has a slightly dubious reputation in society, and Belinda and her kind of form a friendship, and Belinda sort of has this influence over Lady Delacour in terms of like helping to reform her character, I suppose. Meanwhile, there are also sort of two young men whom Belinda is potentially interested in, sort of set up as a love triangle, one of whom is a young man who is a friend of Lady Delacour, and one of whom is a gentleman from the West Indies who she meets through some other people. Belinda is one of those books that I found absolutely fascinating, and I loved bits of, but I don't know that I loved it overall. I feel like there's a lot of stuff to be said about Belinda that I'm not going to have time or like the brain power to say today. So I'm going to link down below a video made by Tilly from Tilly's Shelf a few years ago where she read Belinda, I think in Jane Austen July. She made a really interesting video which talks about gender and race in Belinda, which I watched at the time, and I remember thinking that I wanted to read Belinda, and then I went back and rewatched it after having read Belinda, and I found it really, really interesting to watch again because Mariah Edgeworth's Belinda is really, really interesting in terms of looking at race and gender in the early 19th century. There's a lot of stuff about gender and sort of like what women should be, a lot of which I found quite frustrating, but also like in a really interesting way. And then sort of like race and nationality is quite interesting in Belinda too. So as I mentioned, there is a character who is from the West Indies, and he's described as being Creole, which at this point in time sometimes meant mixed race and sometimes just meant of European extraction, but born and raised in the West Indies. So it's not clear whether Mr. Vincent is a person of colour, but it is like maybe implied, which is quite interesting for, you know, a book from this point in time. And Vincent has a manservant, Juba, who's come with him from the West Indies, who is black and who is featured in the book. His presentation like isn't great and is quite stereotyped. But interestingly, when I was kind of looking stuff up about Belinda online, apparently in the original version of Belinda, there was a subplot in which Juba had a relationship with a white servant girl, which took out of a subsequent edition because her father really objected to it, which is really, really fascinating. So I don't know what other things about Juba's presentation might have been changed, but that is really, really interesting. And I feel like Mariah Edgeworth's Belinda is definitely a book which is really engaging with questions of gender and race. You know, there's quite a bit of discussion about abolition and the slave trade and the empire, which is really, really interesting. Like, I think a lot of people, when they read Mansfield Park by Jane Austen, try to read stuff into it about the slave trade, some of which is there, but it's not there in a big way. And all that stuff that people are looking for in Mansfield Park that isn't quite there is really there in Belinda, like as a much more important part of the book. And so I feel like Belinda is a really, really interesting book if you've found that like very small element in Mansfield Park interesting. And you know, it's a book from 1801, there is racism in it, and like I said, some of the gender stuff was not great either, but I think it is a really really, really interesting book if you're interested in books from this time, with a lot of like really, really interesting themes. I think Tilly talks about this much better in her video, which I'll link down below. But yeah, I think I had a lot of mixed feelings about Belinda. Basically, it's one of those books I found really, 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 really fascinating, but I don't know if I liked it. And especially there were certain things about the ending that I just found like really annoying. There were quite a few characters where I was like, I don't feel about this character how Mariah Edgeworth wants me to feel about this character. But also, there were a lot of things in it that were really, really interesting. And I feel like I've been talking about it for ages, so I must have found a lot in it to find interesting. So I'm looking forward to reading more by Mariah Edgeworth in the future, is what I'm saying. And yeah, Belinda is definitely worth a read if you're interested in books from this time. Then the other thing that I read from Jane Austen's time was this. This is The Secret Diaries of Anne Lister, Volume 1, I Know My Own Heart, edited by Helena Whitbread. So this is a collection of extracts from the diary of Anne Lister, who was a real historical figure living between 1791 and 1840, and these are her diaries from the years 1816 to 1824. Anne Lister is a really interesting historical figure. She was an upper class woman woman who was a lesbian. She was having relationships with women, which she documented in her diary in code. Many years later, her diaries were decoded, and these diaries became, you know, a really, really important source in LGBTQ plus history. And these diaries are absolutely fascinating. I've done a whole video discussing these diaries, which I'll link down below, and I talked about them a lot in my Jane Austen July vlogs too, so I'm not going to go on too much about this book here. But this was my highlight of Jane Austen July completely, and this was fantastic and fascinating, and I cannot recommend this enough. Anyone who has like any interest in the past, read this, it's the best. It's so interesting. The most interesting thing I've read in terms of social history. There's so much in here that's really interesting in terms of sexuality and gender history, but also it's fascinating as a historical source about class, about everyday life, and there's just like so much in here. I mean, I tabbed a lot, and I have like pages and pages and pages of notes. This was really, really fascinating, really, really moving, and also like a really, really enjoyable reading experience. I feel like I got to know Anne Lister as a person so well. I feel like emotionally attached to Anne Lister. And Anne Lister loves books as well, and the way she writes about her love of books and like the comfort books bring her, it's just delightful. And I just really, really, really love this. Like I said, I've done other videos, so I'll link them down below, but this was my highlight of Jane Austen July and one of my favourite books of the year so far. Moving slightly further on in time, I read one thing this month from 1936, which was a stage adaptation of Pride and Prejudice called Miss Elizabeth Bennet, written by A.A. Milne. So this is a play that A.A. Milne, as in the author of Winnie the Pooh, wrote of Pride and Prejudice, which was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed reading this. It was good fun to read, and it was really interesting to see how A.A. Milne managed to like squish up together a lot of the story of Pride and Prejudice into not that many scenes. I do feel like the ending was really rushed. Like the midpoint of Pride and Prejudice is probably like 70% of the way through the play, but I still really, really enjoyed it. It was really good fun and very entertaining, and I feel like some of the character interactions and like the extra witty lines given to Elizabeth Bennet were just like done really, really well. The presentation of Mr. Darcy was interesting. I spoke more about this in one of my vlogs, but A.A. Milne decided that Darcy wasn't attractive enough as a person, so he made him funnier, which is like just fascinating. He actually like admits that that was his purpose in the introduction to the play, which is really interesting and kind of fascinating. But yeah, I really enjoyed Miss Elizabeth Bennet. It was a good fun read. And then I read some Jane Austen retellings for the fourth challenge of Jane Austen July, which is to read a retelling of a Jane Austen book or a work of historical fiction set in Jane Austen's time. I read 3 Jane Austen retellings, one historical, 2 set in the present day, and the historical retelling I read was The Murder of Mr. Wickham by Claudia Gray, which I listened to on audiobook and I really enjoyed. So The Murder of Mr. Wickham is a reimagining of Jane Austen's books where all of the characters from Jane Austen's books know each other, and various characters from various Jane Austen books are brought together to stay at Donwell Abbey from the book Emma. They're beginning a big, nice house party, they're at a dinner party, when suddenly Mr. Wickham shows up, and then Mr. Wickham, as you might guess from the title, gets murdered. And the question is, which of the various characters from Jane Austen have killed Mr. Wickham? Obviously it's a bit silly, but like it's excellent, excellent fun. I feel like the characterization was really well done, especially if I compare The Murder of Mr. Wickham to Death Comes to Pemberley, the other murder mystery Jane Austen retelling I've read. When I read Death Comes to Pemberley a few years ago, I didn't feel that any of the characters in Death Comes to Pemberley really like bore any resemblance to the characters from Pride and Prejudice, whereas the characters in The Murder of Mr. Wickham, I felt like they did really bear resemblance to their originals from Jane Austen's work. I feel like Claudia Gray's interpretation of Frederick Wentworth and Fanny Price and Edmund Bertram was not quite my interpretation of those characters, but I feel like her interpretation was valid. It just wasn't like the direction I would have gone in. My 2 favourite characters, however, were Juliet Tilney and Jonathan Darcy, who are not characters from Jane Austen's books, but relations of characters from Jane Austen's books. And I just really, really enjoyed their friendship and their personalities, and I gather there is a second book in the series which also follows Juliet Tilney and Jonathan Darcy solving a mystery together, which I'm really looking forward to because I think that'll be really fun. Then I read 2 contemporary retellings of Pride and Prejudice. The first one was Just As You Are by Camille Kellogg, which is a modern queer retelling of Pride and Prejudice set in New York, which I really, really, really enjoyed. Just As You Are is a pretty like direct retelling of Pride and Prejudice, and I really, really enjoyed seeing how like certain scenes or elements from Pride and Prejudice were adapted into the modern world. Just As You Are follows a woman woman called Liz, who lives with her housemates Jane, Kitty and Lydia. And the four of them all work at a queer magazine called Netherfield. Netherfield is struggling a lot financially, and it is about to shut down when it is fortuitously bought by two wealthy businesswomen, Daria and Bailey, the Darcy and Bailey characters, who come in, and you know, everything goes on from there. I really loved Just As You Are. I thought it was so fun and really nicely done, and I feel like the interpretation of so many little moments and bits from Pride and Prejudice and the kind of like translation to them into this modern setting just worked really well. Like, I love the magazine setup, it's such a fun idea, and I feel like the dynamic between Daria and Liz and kind of like the plot progression of that was done really well and was paced really well. And I also liked all the subplots and all the stuff to do with the magazine, and I feel like both Daria and Liz had like a lot of personal growth and character development, just as Elizabeth and Darcy do in Pride and Prejudice, and I just thought it was a really fantastic Pride and Prejudice retelling, and also just a fantastic rom-com. Like, leaving aside Pride and Prejudice, it's a great rom-com that is really good fun and has a lot of like sort of self-worth and self-confidence themes, which I really liked, and I would just definitely recommend it. I thought it was a great read. Then the other Pride and Prejudice retelling I read was Aisha at Last by Uzma Jalaluddin. This is a much looser Pride and Prejudice retelling, I would say, and we're following Aisha and Khalid, who are the kind of Elizabeth and Darcy figures, and various other things that are going on in their lives, including their kind of like joint efforts to save the local mosque, which is struggling financially. As I said, this is a much looser Pride and Prejudice retelling. I would say that like Just As You Are is a pretty direct retelling of Pride and Prejudice, whereas this is more like Bridget Jones's Diary kind of retelling of Pride and Prejudice, where there is a bit of a Pride and Prejudice feel to the love story, and then like some things towards the ending mirror certain things in Pride and Prejudice, but overall there's not like as many characters you can map onto Pride and Prejudice. There is an Elizabeth and a Darcy character, there's sort of a Lydia and a Wickham character, and I guess there is kind of a Lady Catherine de Bourgh character, but it's a less like direct retelling, I suppose. Basically, it took me a little while to get into, and then I really loved the last third, which is when it became a little bit more Pride and Prejudice-y in terms of the plot. However, thinking about it afterwards, the first two thirds, which don't really map onto Pride and Prejudice, do contain a lot of themes to do with pride and themes to do with prejudice, and I actually feel like, thinking about this more after the fact, I really liked the way that this book took the themes of Pride and Prejudice and applied them in different ways, while also taking like elements of the plot of Pride and Prejudice. I did enjoy this. I really got into it in the second half of the book, and I do feel like the themes are really interesting, but I think I probably like my Pride and Prejudice retellings like slightly more direct, and actually I read this like immediately after Just As You Are, which was very direct, so obviously I was kind of comparing them in my mind, and maybe I didn't love this quite as much as Just As You Are, but I do feel like it was a really interesting retelling, and yeah, one I would still recommend. Then finally, for my reading in Jane Austen July, I read Behind Closed Doors by Amanda Vickery. This is a work of non-fiction history. The subtitle is At Home in Georgian England, and so I read this for the prompt to read a non-fiction book about Jane Austen, or about her time, and this is obviously about Jane Austen's time. This is a work of academic history, so I wouldn't really recommend it for everyone. It's not super commercial, and it is like quite dense, but I did find it really interesting. Basically, this is a series of chapters kind of looking at a different theme relating to home life and domestic life in Georgian England, and in each chapter Amanda Vickery takes like 5 or 6 primary sources, you know, diaries, account books, that kind of thing from the time, and uses them to draw conclusions about patterns of life in Georgian England. Like I said, I found this really interesting, but it was quite dense. It took me like 4 months to read, and while I found it really interesting, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it to everyone. If you don't read many history books, it's probably not going to be for you, but I did find it really interesting, and I'm very glad that I've read it. So those are the 12 books that I read in Jane Austen July, but I will quickly mention the 2 things I watched for Jane Austen July. So our 6th challenge for Jane Austen July is always to watch a direct screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, and for this I watched the 2007 Northanger Abbey adaptation, which I have seen before but not for years, and I really enjoyed it. I'd forgotten how much I love it. I feel like it does a really good job of like adapting the kind of like gothic vibes of Northanger Abbey. They have these like little dream sequences where Catherine Morland has like a little flight of fancy of something like gothic that you see, and then goes back to her normality, and I feel like that element and that like artistic decision just like really works so well to capture that like fun meta critiquing novels of the time elements you have in Northanger Abbey that would be like quite easy to lose on screen. So I really, really recommend the 2007 Northanger Abbey. It's a really, really great watch. And then the other thing I watched for the 7th challenge of Jane Austen July, to watch a screen retelling or a modern screen adaptation of a Jane Austen book, I watched Rational Creatures, which is a wonderful, wonderful web series on YouTube, which is an adaptation of Persuasion, and it was just fantastic. I really, really, really loved it. So I had watched the first series before, and then the second series came out a few months ago, so I watched the first series and the second series back to back, and I just love Rational Creatures. I think it's so good. It's a really, really great retelling of Persuasion, which just adapts a lot of things in a really, really nice way. I loved the ending. I thought it was so beautiful, and I feel like the way Rational Creatures chooses to adapt certain elements of Persuasion was just really, really fun. And yeah, I just loved Rational Creatures so much. I thought it was so good. It's really, really fun and really, really well done. So I'll leave all the links down below. And that's it. That's everything that I read and watched for Jane Austen July. Do let me know down in the comments how your Jane Austen July went. What was your highlight of the month? And that's all for now. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.